A sick millionaire asked a stranger to pretend to be his daughter for a day. 7 hours later, he was completely shocked by what his wife did. Kara's stomach growled as she leaned against the subway pillar, clutching her nearly empty bag. The cold steel of the turnstile mocked her as she debated whether to head home to her dim basement apartment or try for another job interview she couldn't afford to miss. With only $3 in her pocket and eviction looming, she had little left to lose. Her phone buzzed, an unknown number. Normally she wouldn't answer, but desperation overruled caution. "Ms. Kara Ellis," a formal voice inquired. "We have a business proposal. Discretion required. Substantial compensation involved." Suspicious but intrigued, Kara agreed to meet. The next day, a sleek black car pulled up outside her crumbling building. Inside, a driver handed her a neatly folded note. Asterisk, "You'll be taken to someone who needs your help. Trust is imperative." Asterisk. As the car wove through the city, Kara's mind raced. She'd never been offered anything resembling an opportunity. Her life had been one endless cycle of setbacks. A runaway father, a sick mother she'd lost to cancer, and a series of dead-end jobs that barely kept her afloat. Why now? And who was this mysterious benefactor? The vehicle slowed before a grand iron gate that opened onto an estate straight out of a magazine. Rolling lawns, an opulent fountain, and a sprawling mansion loomed ahead. The driver ushered Kara to the door, where an older man in a tailored suit introduced himself as Malcolm, the family's butler. "Please," he said, gesturing toward a sun-drenched drawing room. "He's waiting." "He?" Kara asked, her voice faltering. Before she could demand more answers, the butler opened the doors, revealing a frail yet commanding man seated in an antique chair. His eyes, piercing but kind, fixed on her. "Ms. Ellis," he said, his voice trembling but resolute. "Thank you for coming." Who are you?" Kara stammered, overwhelmed by the sheer opulence of her surroundings. "My name is Arthur Montgomery," the man replied. "I am dying, and I need your help." Arthur Montgomery had a presence that demanded attention, despite his frail frame. His pallor hinted at years of suffering, his thin hands trembling slightly as they rested on the ornate arms of his chair. A tube of oxygen snaked discreetly from a nearby tank, underscoring his fragility. Yet, his voice carried the weight of a man who once commanded boardrooms. "I know you're wondering why you're here," Arthur began, his gaze steady. "And why I chose you of all people." Kara nodded, her mind swirling with unanswered questions. "Let me start with the truth. I am dying stage 4 lung cancer. The doctors have given me weeks, perhaps days. What I want from you, Ms. Ellis, is something money cannot buy. A fleeting taste of love, family, and connection." Kara blinked, unsure how to respond. I don't understand. You have family, don't you? Someone who..." Arthur's smile was bitter, his laugh dry. "A family in name only. My daughter passed away years ago in a car accident. My wife, Eleanor, has grown distant, preoccupied, and I am left with memories, regrets, and an emptiness I cannot escape." His words settled in the room like a thick fog. Kara's heart clenched, but skepticism crept in alongside sympathy. "Why me? You don't even know me." Arthur leaned forward, his piercing blue eyes meeting hers. "That's precisely why. You have no stake in my wealth, no hidden agenda. You are genuine." Before Kara could protest, he continued, "I want you to pretend to be my daughter for a single day. 7 hours to be exact. I want to know what it feels like to be loved by someone who isn't driven by greed or obligation." The enormity of his request hit her. Pretend to be his daughter. The idea was absurd, yet the raw vulnerability in his voice made it impossible to dismiss outright. "You're asking me to lie," Kara said carefully. "I'm asking you to give a dying man 1 day of peace," Arthur corrected. "You'll be well compensated. Enough to erase your debts and rebuild your life." Kara's breath caught. It was a tempting offer, but something about the situation felt off. Her gaze flickered to a portrait on the wall, a younger Arthur with a strikingly beautiful woman and a teenage girl who radiated joy. The daughter he'd lost. Before she could respond, another figure entered the room. "Arthur," a woman's voice called, sharp and controlled. Kara turned to see Eleanor Montgomery, regal and impeccably dressed, her expression unreadable. "Who is this?" Eleanor asked, her tone laced with suspicion. Her cold eyes settled on Kara, sending a chill down her spine. Arthur's voice was firm but gentle. "Eleanor, this is Kara. She's here to help." Eleanor's gaze lingered, calculating and cold, before she turned sharply and left. Kara shivered, unsure if she had stepped into a dream or a nightmare. The silence following Eleanor's abrupt exit was suffocating. Kara shifted uncomfortably in her seat, glancing toward Arthur, whose expression remained calm, almost resigned. "Forgive my wife," he said softly, his voice carrying a trace of sadness. "Eleanor has adjusted poorly to the prospect of my death. Her own way of coping is to keep her distance." Kara didn't know what to say. Her instincts told her to leave, but something about Arthur's weary yet hopeful demeanor pinned her in place. Arthur broke the silence. "You're unsure. Understand. This is not a small thing I'm asking of you. Pretending to be someone else, your daughter, it's complicated," Kara replied, her voice hesitant. "I don't even know what she was like." Arthur's lips curved into a wistful smile. "Olivia, my daughter, was bright, compassionate and headstrong. She had her mother's wit and my stubbornness. She could charm a room or argue her way out of trouble with ease." His eyes grew distant as he continued. "She loved painting, though her mother thought it frivolous. I still keep her last work in my study. A simple sunset, but it carries so much of her spirit. I miss her every day." The weight of his grief hung heavy in the room. Kara bit her lip, unsure if she could bear the responsibility he was placing on her. "I don't know if I can do this," she admitted. Just me. I'm not Olivia." Arthur reached out, his thin hand resting lightly on hers. "I'm not asking for perfection, just your presence. Talk to me, share a meal, let me imagine, even for a few hours, that I'm not alone." Her heart ached at his plea, but doubt lingered. "And Eleanor? She doesn't seem thrilled about whatever this is." Arthur sighed deeply. Eleanor's relationship with Olivia was strained. "She may not understand why I need this, but I assure you she will not interfere. I've made arrangements." Arrangements. The word unsettled Kara, but before she could ask, Arthur added, "There's a document in the hands of my attorney. It grants you full compensation once the day is over. If you're uncomfortable, you're free to leave now." The offer hung in the air, tempting and impossible to ignore. A day of pretending, and she could wipe her slate clean, start over. Yet, something about Arthur's fragile hope touched her deeply. It wasn't just about the money. This man was clinging to his last threads of humanity. "I'll do it," she heard herself say, surprising even herself. "For one day." Arthur's face softened with relief. "Thank you, Ms. Ellis." "Kara," she corrected. "If I'm going to be Olivia, call me Kara." Arthur chuckled, a sound that carried more warmth than she'd expected. "Very well, Kara." The next morning, a sleek black car once again pulled up to Kara's crumbling apartment. This time, she carried a duffel bag with a change of clothes, though she doubted she'd need it in a place as grand as Arthur's mansion. The driver nodded silently as she climbed in, and soon, the city's chaos faded into quiet countryside. As the car approached the Montgomery estate, Kara found herself bracing for the sheer opulence. When the gates swung open and the sprawling mansion came into view, it still took her breath away. The grandeur felt surreal. Rolling lawns, fountains glittering in the morning sun, and ivy creeping artfully along the stone walls. Malcolm, the butler, greeted her at the door with the same professional politeness. "Miss Kara, Mr. Montgomery is waiting for you in the west parlor." "Thanks," she said, trying not to sound as intimidated as she felt. The west parlor was even more stunning in daylight. Light poured through massive windows, illuminating antique furniture and art that looked like it belonged in a museum. Arthur sat in his usual chair, his oxygen tank humming quietly beside him. "Good morning, Olivia," he said, his voice warm but expectant. Kara froze for a moment, her nerves threatening to betray her. Then she took a deep breath and stepped into the role. "Morning, Dad," she replied, her voice steady but unsure. The word felt foreign on her tongue, but Arthur's smile made it feel right. They spent the first few hours in casual conversation, Arthur gently guiding Kara into memories of Olivia's life. He showed her photo albums, pointing out family vacations, birthday parties, and even Olivia's art competitions. "She always painted with her whole heart," Arthur said, his voice tinged with pride. "This one here, Amber Skies, won first place in the state fair. I remember how she jumped with joy when they called her name." Kara studied the painting, a fiery sunset over a tranquil lake. It was beautiful and haunting, much like the man's memories. She found herself wanting to live up to the person he missed so dearly. As the day wore on, Kara grew more comfortable. They shared stories, Arthur about his youth, Kara about her struggles. She found herself laughing, genuinely enjoying his company. "You remind me of her," Arthur said suddenly, his eyes soft. "Not just the way you look, though it's uncanny, but your spirit. You've been through hell, haven't you?" Kara hesitated, her chest tightening. "I guess I have. And yet, here you are," Arthur said. "That's what Olivia had too. Strength." For the first time in years, Kara felt seen, not as a struggling waitress scraping by, but as someone worth knowing. She smiled, the warmth in Arthur's gaze filling a void she hadn't realized was so deep. The sense of peace that had settled over the mansion during Kara's bonding with Arthur began to unravel by early afternoon. Eleanor's presence hung like a shadow, her sharp heels clicking on the marble floors, a constant reminder that Kara wasn't truly welcome. At lunch, Eleanor joined them, her demeanor frosty and her words laced with barbs. The dining room, grand and bathed in golden light, could not soften the tension. "So, Kara," Eleanor said, drawing out her name as if tasting something unpleasant, "what is it that brought you into our lives? Chance meeting? Or perhaps you were simply available?" Arthur's expression tightened, but he remained silent. Kara forced a polite smile. "I guess you could say I was in the right place at the right time." "How convenient," Eleanor said, her tone dripping with skepticism. She picked at her salad with calculated disinterest, her eyes narrowing every time Kara spoke. Arthur broke the tension with a warm chuckle. "Eleanor, let's not interrogate the poor girl. She's doing something kind for an old man." "Kindness," Eleanor murmured, her gaze cutting to Arthur. "Yes, that seems to be in short supply these days." The conversation limped along, but the unease lingered. As soon as lunch ended, Eleanor excused herself, leaving a cold silence in her wake. Kara glanced at Arthur, who sighed deeply. "Don't take it personally," he said. "Eleanor struggles with the past." Kara wasn't convinced. It felt like Eleanor's hostility was about more than grief. Later, as Kara wandered the halls trying to gather her thoughts, she stumbled upon the staff kitchen. Inside, two maids were whispering near the counter. They froze when they noticed her, their eyes widening. "Sorry," Kara said quickly. "I didn't mean to interrupt." "It's nothing, miss," one of them said, her face pale. She hurriedly wiped her hands and left the room. The other lingered for a moment, her brow furrowed. "Are you here to help Mr. Montgomery?" the remaining maid asked, her voice low. Kara nodded. "Something like that." The maid hesitated before leaning in. "He's been worse since last week. Some of us think." "Well, never mind." She flushed and busied herself with dishes. "What do you mean?" Kara pressed. "Nothing, miss," the maid said, her voice brisk. "Excuse me." And just like that she left too. Kara's unease deepened. Why the cryptic comments? And why did Eleanor seem so intent on making her feel like an intruder? That evening her suspicions grew. As she passed by Arthur's room, she noticed his medication tray, pills neatly arranged. But something about the arrangement struck her as odd. She couldn't place why, but it felt wrong? Was it her imagination? Or was there more to the Montgomery household than grief and tension? Kara couldn't shake the gnawing feeling that something was wrong. The tension in the house, the cryptic comments from the maid, and Eleanor's icy demeanor painted a picture that didn't add up. Arthur was frail and kind, eager to relive fond memories, but Eleanor seemed more irritated than grieving. It wasn't grief, it was something darker. Her suspicions solidified later that evening when she overheard a hushed conversation in the study. Passing by, she heard Eleanor's voice, sharp and low. "Do you think I don't see what you're doing?" Eleanor hissed. "Bringing in strangers like this, parading her around as if she's Olivia. It's pathetic, Arthur. You're wasting time we don't have." Arthur's voice was softer but firm. "I'm dying, Eleanor. My time is mine to waste." "And what about the estate?" Eleanor snapped. "You know the board is watching every move we make. If they see this spectacle, they'll think you've lost your mind." "Maybe I have," Arthur replied, his voice thick with emotion. "But at least I'll have peace." Eleanor's response was muffled, but Kara caught a single word: reckless. Her heart raced. The conversation hinted at more than just familial tension. It hinted at a battle for control. Later that night, Kara couldn't sleep. The opulence of the guest room did little to comfort her. Her thoughts kept returning to the medication tray she'd seen in Arthur's room. The pills were arranged too perfectly, almost like a display. On impulse, she got up and crept down the hall to his room. The house was eerily silent, the grand hallways casting shadows that danced in the moonlight. When she reached Arthur's room, she hesitated. Was she overstepping? But something urged her forward. Quietly she slipped inside. Arthur was asleep, his breathing labored. She approached the medication tray and examined it more closely. Each pill was labeled, but as she studied the doses, her stomach sank. The labels didn't match the prescribed amounts she'd seen listed earlier in the day on a chart near his bedside. A sound behind her made her freeze. She turned to see Malcolm, the butler, standing in the doorway, his expression grave. "What are you doing, Miss Kara?" he asked quietly. Something's wrong," she stammered. "The medication, it doesn't look right." Malcolm stepped closer, his face tight with concern. He glanced at the tray and sighed. "You're not imagining things. I've suspected for weeks, but I can't say more without proof." "Suspected what?" Kara demanded. "That someone in this house doesn't want Mr. Montgomery to live out his final days," Malcolm whispered. "Be careful, Miss Kara. Not everyone here has good intentions." The next morning, tension crackled in the air like an impending storm. Kara couldn't shake Malcolm's warning, nor the unsettling discovery about Arthur's medication. She decided to confront Arthur, but when she entered the drawing room, she found Eleanor already there, her arms crossed tightly over her chest. "Ah, the imposter joins us," Eleanor said, her tone biting. "Eleanor," Arthur warned, his voice weary but sharp. Kara, emboldened by concern, didn't back down. "I'm not an imposter. I'm here because he asked me to be." "Asked you?" Eleanor scoffed, turning her sharp gaze on Arthur. "How far will you go to indulge this fantasy, Arthur? It's pathetic. And dangerous." "Dangerous," Kara interjected, unable to hold back. "Dangerous for who? For him? Or for you?" Eleanor's eyes narrowed. "Watch your tone, little girl. You have no idea what you've walked into." "No, but I'm starting to figure it out," Kara shot back. She stepped closer, her voice steady despite the fear bubbling under her skin. "Arthur's medication. It's been tampered with, hasn't it?" The room fell silent, the accusation hanging heavy in the air. Arthur blinked, confusion and alarm clouding his face. "What are you saying, Kara?" Kara hesitated but pressed on. "I checked your pill tray last night. The doses are wrong. Someone's been messing with your treatment." Eleanor's face twisted into a sneer. "How dare you make such an accusation without proof?" "Enough." Arthur's voice, though weak, carried authority. He turned to Eleanor, his gaze piercing. "Do you know anything about this, Eleanor?" She stiffened, her mask of composure slipping. Course not. Why would I harm my own husband? The room seemed to shrink as the tension grew unbearable. Kara noticed Eleanor's hands trembling. Was it guilt or fury? Suddenly, Arthur's body tensed. His breathing labored. He clutched his chest and his face twisted in pain. Arthur! Kara cried, rushing to his side. Eleanor froze for a moment before reaching for the phone. I'll call the doctor, she said, her voice tight, but her actions were slow, almost reluctant. No time, Kara snapped, grabbing Arthur's oxygen mask and adjusting it to help him breathe. Malcolm. Someone call for help. The butler appeared almost instantly, taking control of the situation. Kara stayed by Arthur's side, holding his hand as his breathing steadied slightly. His grip was weak but grateful. Eleanor stood apart, her eyes unreadable, as Malcolm escorted the paramedics into the room. They whisked Arthur away, leaving the house in a stunned silence. Kara turned to Eleanor, her voice low but firm. Whatever's going on here, I'll find out. Eleanor's lips curled into a cold smile. Be careful what you dig for, Kara. You might not like what you find. The ambulance's siren faded as it sped toward the hospital, leaving the mansion cloaked in an uneasy quiet. Kara stood by the doorway, her fists clenched. Arthur's frail body had looked so small on the stretcher, and the memory of his desperate gasps haunted her. Malcolm approached, his usually composed face etched with worry. Miss Kara, I fear the situation is more dire than you realize. If Mr. Montgomery's condition was worsened intentionally. I know, Kara interrupted, her voice steely. We can't let this go on. But Eleanor's voice cut through the hallway like ice. You're still here. Kara turned to find her standing at the top of the grand staircase, one manicured hand gripping the banister. Her expression was coldly amused, as if she'd already won whatever game was being played. He doesn't need you anymore, Eleanor said. This little charade is over. No, Kara shot back, her fear replaced by a protective fury. You're wrong. He does need me. And I'm not leaving until I know he's safe. Eleanor descended the stairs slowly, her movements calculated. You don't belong here. You're a nobody. A stray Arthur dragged in to soothe his guilt. Kara's heart raced, but she stood her ground. Maybe I don't belong in this mansion or your world, but I care about him. Can you honestly say the same? Eleanor's mask cracked for the briefest moment, anger flaring in her eyes. You have no idea what I've sacrificed for this family. Sacrifice? Kara scoffed, taking a step forward. What kind of sacrifice involves tampering with his medication? You wanted him weaker, didn't you? So you could. Enough. Eleanor's voice rang out, sharp and commanding. But before she could say more, the front door burst open, and a uniformed officer stepped inside, followed by a paramedic. Excuse me, the officer said, his voice firm. We need to speak with the household staff regarding Mr. Montgomery's condition. There are irregularities in his recent medical records. Eleanor stiffened, her eyes darting to Kara and Malcolm. Irregularities. This is preposterous. Irregularities like overdoses, the paramedic clarified, his gaze unyielding. We're running tests now. Kara felt a mix of vindication and dread. She exchanged a glance with Malcolm, who gave her a slight nod. Eleanor's carefully crafted composure crumbled further as the officer approached. Mrs. Montgomery, we'll need to ask you some questions. Eleanor's eyes burned with fury as she turned to Kara. You think you've won, don't you? This isn't over. Kara didn't respond. She simply watched as Eleanor's perfect world began to crack under the weight of her lies. The sterile white of the hospital room was a stark contrast to the Montgomery mansion's grandeur. Kara sat beside Arthur's bed, her heart heavy as she watched him sleep. The rhythmic beeping of the monitors offered some reassurance that he was stable, for now. She glanced at Malcolm, who stood near the door, his face unreadable. It had been hours since they arrived, but the tension hadn't lessened. The doctors had confirmed what Kara suspected. Arthur's medications had been tampered with. The doses had been altered over time, steadily weakening him. The implications were chilling. The door opened and a doctor entered, her expression grim but professional. Kara stood, bracing herself. "How is he?" "Mr. Montgomery is stable for now," the doctor replied. "But we've identified substances in his bloodstream that should never have been there. Someone has been intentionally poisoning him." Kara felt her stomach twist. Hearing it said aloud made the horror all too real. "Do you know who's responsible?" Kara asked, her voice trembling. The doctor hesitated. "The authorities are investigating. But whoever did this had access to his medication. Someone close to him." As if summoned, the door opened again, this time admitting 2 police officers. One of them carried a folder, which he handed to Malcolm. "We've obtained preliminary evidence," the officer said. "It includes altered prescriptions and tampered pill bottles found in the mansion. The handwriting on the altered instructions matches Mrs. Montgomery's." Kara's heart sank, even as a wave of anger coursed through her. She thought of Arthur's hopeful eyes, his fragile trust, and the love he still held for a family that didn't deserve it. Malcolm's face darkened as he reviewed the folder. "This is damning," he muttered. The officer nodded grimly. "We'll need to speak with Mr. Montgomery once he's strong enough. But this aligns with other testimony." "Other testimony?" Kara asked, confused. The officer turned to her. One of the household staff came forward. A maid who suspected foul play. She admitted she'd been too afraid to act sooner, but your presence made her feel safe enough to tell the truth. Kara blinked, surprised. She hadn't realized her actions had made such an impact. Arthur stirred, his weak voice drawing their attention. "Kara," he murmured. She rushed to his side, taking his hand. "I'm here." His eyes fluttered open, confusion clouding them. "What's happening?" Kara hesitated, unsure how much to tell him, but Malcolm stepped forward, his voice steady. "The truth is coming to light, sir. And you're safe now." Arthur's gaze shifted to Kara, gratitude softening his features. "Thank you." "Olivia," he whispered, tears brimming in his eyes. Kara's chest tightened. For the first time, the name didn't feel foreign. Felt like a promise. The next morning, the mansion buzzed with an eerie calm. Eleanor Montgomery had been taken into police custody overnight, the damning evidence enough for authorities to move swiftly. Kara couldn't help but feel a mix of relief and sorrow as she watched the news unfold. Despite Eleanor's cruelty, the fallout was a tragedy for Arthur. Back at the hospital, Arthur's condition had stabilized. Kara stood by his bedside as the doctor performed a final check. Arthur's pale face looked stronger, his breathing easier. The poison that had slowly drained his life was finally gone. "You're improving, Mr. Montgomery," the doctor said with a smile. "Your strength should return with time." Arthur nodded weakly, then turned to Kara, his gaze heavy with emotion. "They told me about Eleanor." Kara swallowed, unsure how to respond. "I'm sorry," she said softly. "I didn't want you to find out this way." "She was my wife for 30 years, Arthur said, his voice tinged with sorrow. "I knew she could be cold, calculating even, but this—" He trailed off, his eyes distant, as if trying to reconcile the woman he once loved with the one who betrayed him. Kara reached for his hand. "You didn't deserve this, Arthur." "None of it." Arthur gave her a small, grateful smile. "And yet, I've been given something better in these last few days. Your kindness. Your courage. It has reminded me what real love looks like." Kara felt a lump in her throat. She hadn't expected Arthur's gratitude to touch her so deeply. Later that afternoon, Arthur's lawyer arrived at the hospital. His demeanor brisk but kind. "Mr. Montgomery," he began, "we've begun proceedings to revoke Eleanor's access to the estate. Her actions have voided her rights under the will." Arthur nodded, his expression resolute. "She forfeited her place in my life the moment she tried to take it away. Make sure she has nothing further to gain from my name." The lawyer hesitated, then turned to Kara. "Mr. Montgomery has also requested we amend the estate to include you." "What?" Kara's eyes widened. Arthur, no, I didn't help you for money. I know, Arthur replied gently. But you've earned more than my gratitude, Kara. You've earned my trust. I want to make sure you're taken care of, just as you've taken care of me. Tears welled in Kara's eyes. She tried to protest, but Arthur shook his head. Let me do this, Kara. For once in my life, I want to leave a legacy I'm proud of. The hospital room was quiet, save for the soft hum of machines monitoring Arthur's vitals. Kara remained by his side, reluctant to leave even as the day stretched on. The chaos of the past 24 hours had subsided, leaving space for a quiet intimacy that felt almost sacred. Arthur turned his head toward her, a small smile on his face. You don't have to stay, you know. I'm sure you have a life to return to. Kara chuckled softly, shaking her head. Not much of a life, really. Just an overdue rent notice and a cranky landlord. Arthur frowned, a flicker of guilt crossing his features. I hate that this world has been so unkind to you. It's not all bad, Kara said, her voice warm. If it hadn't been for all those hard times, I might not have been desperate enough to answer that strange phone call. And I wouldn't have met you. Arthur's expression softened, his blue eyes glistening. You remind me so much of Olivia, not just in how you look but in how you carry yourself. You're strong, resourceful, and kind. She had that same light. Kara shifted uncomfortably, unsure how to respond. I'm not her, Arthur. I know, he said, reaching for her hand. His grip was weak but steady. But you've given me something I thought I'd lost forever. You've reminded me of what it feels like to be loved, not out of obligation or greed, but because someone cares. Tears pricked Kara's eyes. She thought back to the countless moments in her life when she'd longed for someone to say those words to her, to see her. She squeezed his hand gently. You've given me something too, Arthur. For the first time I feel like I'm not just surviving. Like I matter. Arthur smiled, his gaze brimming with warmth. You do matter, Kara. Don't let anyone make you think otherwise. As the afternoon wore on, they talked more about Arthur's life. His triumphs and regrets, the way he built his empire and the cost it had exacted on his relationships. Kara shared pieces of her own story. Her mother's battle with cancer, her struggles to stay afloat, and the dreams she'd shelved long ago. I used to love writing, she admitted. When I was younger I wanted to write novels, but life had other plans. Then write, Arthur said simply, as if it were the easiest thing in the world. It's not that simple, Kara replied with a wry smile. Why not? Arthur asked, his tone serious. You've already done the hardest thing imaginable. You've saved a man's soul. Writing is easy compared to that. Kara laughed through her tears, the sound light and freeing. In that moment, the weight of the past seemed to lift, leaving room for something new, hope. The days that followed felt like a quiet transformation, for both Kara and Arthur. After the tumult of uncovering Eleanor's betrayal and stabilizing Arthur's health, the dust began to settle. But it wasn't the same as before. Something deeper had shifted. Arthur insisted Kara remain at the mansion, turning her temporary stay into an indefinite one. Though she initially resisted, the warmth in his plea softened her resolve. Please, he had said. I'm not ready to let go of the only family I have left. Family, Kara repeated, the word catching in her throat. It was a foreign concept to her after years of loneliness, but when Arthur said it, it felt right. Arthur's recovery progressed slowly but steadily. He spent his mornings in the sunlit study, poring over books or gazing at Olivia's painting. Kara joined him often, reading aloud or simply keeping him company. Though they didn't always speak, the silence was never empty. It was filled with mutual understanding and a growing bond that neither could deny. One evening, as they sat by the fireplace, Arthur handed Kara an envelope. What's this? She asked. Open it, he said, his smile enigmatic. Inside was a check, an amount that made Kara's breath hitch. It wasn't just enough to cover her debts. It was enough to rebuild her life entirely. Arthur, she whispered, shaking her head. This is too much. No, it's not, he replied firmly. You've given me something priceless, Kara. You've reminded me of who I was, and who I still want to be, even in the time I have left. Let me do this for you. Kara hesitated, her instinct to reject such generosity warring with her growing gratitude. I don't even know where to start. Arthur leaned forward, his eyes sparkling. Start wherever you want. Pick up those dreams you told me about. Write your novel, travel, do something that makes you happy. You've really thought about this, haven't you? She said, a smile tugging at her lips. Every moment of every day, he replied with a wink. As weeks turned into months, Kara found herself slipping naturally into her new role in Arthur's life, not as a replacement for Olivia, but as someone he could lean on and trust. In turn, Arthur became more than a benefactor. He became the closest thing to a father she'd ever known. The mansion, once a place of cold grandeur, began to feel like home. Kara's laughter filled the halls, her presence bringing life back to a place that had been steeped in grief for too long. For the first time in years, both Kara and Arthur felt like they belonged. Arthur insisted on taking a walk through the garden, a request that surprised everyone. Though still frail, his determination was undeniable. If I'm going to enjoy the time I have left, I won't spend it all in bed, he quipped, his wit returning as his strength grew. The morning sun bathed the sprawling estate in golden light, and the air smelled of lavender and freshly mowed grass. Kara walked beside him, offering her arm when he needed support. The garden was stunning, but Arthur's focus wasn't on the flowers or the landscape. It was on the moment. This was Olivia's favorite spot, Arthur said as they paused near a rose trellis. She used to sit right here, sketching for hours. She said it felt like the world disappeared. Kara could see it clearly. A young girl, her sketchpad balanced on her knees, her face lit with joy. She must have been incredible, Kara said softly. She was, Arthur replied. Then he turned to her, his expression thoughtful. But so are you, Kara. Kara blushed, ducking her head. I'm just trying to figure things out. Arthur smiled. We all are. But you've brought something to this place that I never thought I'd feel again. Life. They reached a small stone bench beneath a willow tree. Arthur gestured for Kara to sit beside him. I have something for you, he said, pulling a small box from his pocket. Kara blinked in surprise. Arthur, you've already done so much. Humor an old man, he interrupted with a smile, handing her the box. Inside was a delicate necklace with a pendant shaped like an open book. Kara traced it with her fingers, her chest tightening. It's beautiful. It belonged to Olivia, Arthur said, his voice soft. She believed in stories, the ones she told through her art and the ones she lived every day. I want you to have it. Kara's eyes welled with tears. Arthur, I can't, this is. You can, he said firmly. And you will. It's not just about remembering her. It's about honoring her spirit, and yours. Kara fastened the necklace around her neck, the weight of it feeling both grounding and uplifting. Thank you, she whispered. Arthur reached for her hand, his smile warm. Thank you, Kara, for giving me back something I thought I'd lost forever. They sat beneath the willow for a long time, the silence filled with gratitude and peace. It wasn't the end of their story. It was the beginning of something new. The headlines the next day were splashed across every major paper. Heiress arrested in shocking poisoning scandal. Eleanor's downfall had sent shockwaves through the community. Once a beacon of social prestige, she was now facing charges of attempted murder and fraud. The Montgomery name, synonymous with power and wealth, was dragged into scandal, but Arthur bore it with quiet dignity. For him, the damage to his reputation mattered far less than the peace that had finally returned to his life. Kara watched the news from the mansion's study. Her emotions conflicted. She'd never wanted to destroy anyone, not even Eleanor. But as the evidence mounted, altered prescriptions, secret financial transactions, and testimony from the maid who'd overheard incriminating conversations, it was clear that Eleanor had prioritized greed over love. She's going to prison, isn't she? Kara asked as Malcolm entered the room. Most likely, Malcolm replied. The evidence is overwhelming. Do you think Arthur will be okay? She asked, her voice tinged with worry. Malcolm gave her a reassuring smile. Mr. Montgomery has faced many trials in his life. He'll weather this one, especially with you by his side. Kara nodded, her fingers grazing the book-shaped pendant around her neck. It was a small but constant reminder of everything she had gained, and everything Arthur had lost. Later that afternoon, Arthur and Kara sat together as his lawyer updated them on the legal proceedings. With Eleanor's removal from the estate, we've secured her assets and ensured they'll be used to maintain the charitable initiatives she once neglected. Arthur nodded thoughtfully. Good. Let some good come of all this. The lawyer hesitated before continuing. There's also the matter of your personal legacy. I've finalized the transfer of funds to Miss Kara's name, as you requested. Kara stiffened, her heart skipping a beat. Arthur, I told you I didn't need. And I told you it wasn't a negotiation, Arthur interrupted, his tone gentle but firm. This isn't about charity, Kara. It's about giving you the chance to live fully, without the chains of the past holding you back. She felt the lump rise in her throat again. I don't know what to say. Say you'll honor it, Arthur said. Use it to write your story. Build a life that makes you happy. That's all I want. Tears filled Kara's eyes as she nodded. I will. I promise. The lawyer excused himself, leaving them in a rare moment of quiet. Arthur reached for Kara's hand. Together we've survived betrayal and loss. But now it's time to build something new. Kara smiled through her tears. I think we already have. The crisp morning air carried a sense of renewal as Kara stood at the edge of the beach, gazing out at the endless waves. Arthur had insisted they take this trip, a symbolic way to close one chapter and begin another. The ocean stretched before them, vast and unyielding, a reminder of how life's currents could shift in unpredictable and beautiful ways. Arthur sat in a wheelchair under the shade of a large umbrella, a blanket draped over his lap. Though his body was still frail, his spirit seemed unbreakable. He watched Kara with a peaceful smile as she approached, a journal tucked under her arm. Have you started yet? Arthur asked, his eyes twinkling with curiosity. Kara grinned, holding up the journal. First page. It's a working title, but I think it might be Second Chances. Arthur chuckled softly, his laugh carrying a warmth that made Kara's chest ache with gratitude. A fitting title, don't you think? She nodded, sitting down beside him in the sand. I think it's about more than just me. It's about you too. Arthur's smile widened. You've given me more than a second chance, Kara. You've given me a reason to believe that even at the end of life, there's still room for new beginnings. They sat in companionable silence for a while, the sound of the waves filling the gaps between their words. Kara felt the weight of everything they had endured together, the heartbreak, the betrayal, the healing. Yet, as she looked at Arthur, she realized how much lighter life felt now. You know, Arthur said after a moment, I used to think my legacy would be my business, my wealth. But it's not. It's this moments like these. People like you. Kara reached over, squeezing his hand. And I used to think I wasn't capable of anything more than survival. But you've shown me I'm capable of so much more. Arthur turned his head toward her, his expression earnest. Promise me something, Kara. Anything, she said without hesitation. Promise me you'll keep going, he said. No matter what happens, no matter where life takes you. Don't stop writing your story. Tears welled in her eyes, but she smiled. I promise. The sun dipped lower on the horizon, painting the sky in shades of amber and gold. Kara opened her journal, her pen hovering over the page as Arthur watched. With a deep breath, she began to write. Weeks later, Arthur's mansion buzzed with life again. Kara had moved on to pursue her dreams but remained a constant in Arthur's life. The story they had written together inspired her to give talks, advocate for the rights of patients like Arthur, and tell her tale to audiences far and wide. As the final words of her book echoed in her mind, Kara felt a deep sense of peace. Love is not about blood or obligation. It's about showing up when it matters most. Sometimes family is found where you least expect it.